Hello, everyone. How are you? And how is your day going? I hope that is all well with you. I welcome you to our 14th lecture in Introduction to Literature. And today we are going to start with free verse, which is going to be the conclusion of our lectures about poetry. The reason why we are covering this topic is that it's one of the major developments that occurred to poetry. And since you have been studying poetry and since you covered a lot of poetic types, it's really important that we move and speak about one major thing that happened to poetry, and this is the movement towards modernity and free verse. You know, one of the major problems that face English poetry is the question of rhyme, because English is not a rhyming language. And for your information, English poetry was not rhymed in its early beginnings. It's only when English poetry was influenced by French poetry that it became rhymed, and this was during the Middle Ages. So rhyme remained a big problem. And again, there is something that happened in history, and this was in the 19th century, specifically in the second half of the 19th century, when English poetry was also influenced by French poetry in a movement towards freeing poetry of its restrictions. Under the influence of French poetry, as I said, English poetry became rhymed, and this was in the medieval times. Again, the movement towards free verse also occurred in France, because French poetry was known for its rigid rules of versification, and the movement developed in many European countries, including England. And probably you know that it also affected the Arab world. So what is a free verse? Definitely, I'm not going to go deep into this because I understand that this is just an introduction to literature, and I hope that we are going to speak in depth when we take our poetry course. The first question that comes to mind is, what is free verse? Free verse is actually poetry that doesn't have a regular rhythm, line length, or rhyme scheme. Instead, it depends on the natural rhythms of speech, that is, everyday speech. And today, this is the most preferred form of poetry for many British as well as American writers. Um, we understand that free verse is free of traditional rules of writing poetry. It is free of rhyme, meter, or a fixed length for the line. So we notice that poets try to find the new ways and the new methods in order to compensate the lack of rhyme or regular rhythm. Now, what are the distinguishing features of free verse? In what way it is different from other forms of traditional, or let me call it classical verse? The first thing is that it doesn't use rhyme. It doesn't use rhyme. Number two, it doesn't use meter. And if it does, it uses irregular meter. And I'm trying to tell you that the focus of poetry shifted from sound devices to language devices. And that's why you notice that language devices acquire more importance in a free verse, and we have more use of metaphors, similes, personification, and other figures of speech. Another thing that distinguishes free verse is the focus on images. We notice that a lot of modern poems focus on the use of imagery. That is, it is possible to find a poem which is just an image. Free verse is also concrete and not abstract because it focuses on everyday objects, things that we deal with on daily basis. Also, we notice heightened attention to sound by using alliteration, assonance, consonants, and other sound elements. So, a free verse does not have traditional meter. Also, it doesn't have a regular rhyme scheme. Probably you still remember that we said that, for example, the English sonnet. The English sonnet has a fixed rhyme scheme, if you remember it. A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Also, we notice that if the poem has couplets, it will rhyme as A, B, B, C, C, D, D. Now, in modern free verse, we don't have this kind of rhyme scheme, which is regular. Rhyme is not a requirement in free verse, and therefore we don't have a fixed rhyme scheme in poetry. Now, you know that poetry is the fusion of sound and sense. So, how can poetry continue to be musical? The poet will employ other methods to make poetry musical. And one important tool is alliteration. Another one is assonance. A third one would be consonance. Meter and sound are not determined by rules, but rather by correspondence between feeling, impression, and poetic form, and not by conventional rules of poetic diction. We notice that even the division into stanzas disappeared, and the poet can now arrange his poem depending on moving from one idea to another idea, or one impression to another, one feeling to another. The other thing is the unifying element became the use of poetic line. You know, while we were studying poetry, if you still remember, I kept saying that this is a couplet and this is a quatrain, etc. But when we come to a free verse, the unit is a line, very much like Arabic. In Arabic, the unit of the poem is the line. Now, when the shift was made from a classical verse to a free verse, we shifted from the stanza to the line. Also, we notice that there is more flexibility of verse line length. What I'm trying to say is that if we think of traditional stanzas, they have fixed length because you know you have to abide by the rules of writing poetry and basically meter. But when we come to free verse, we notice that there are poems where you have one long line followed by a short line followed by a shorter line. You have lines that have like 12 words followed by a line of 5 words. Sometimes you have just one word in a line of poetry. If we go back to old times, a poet cannot do that, cannot have a long line and a short line. But in free verse, this is possible. This is a brief introduction to free verse. And inshallah, when you take poetry, we will go into details. I know we are living difficult times and it's the time of the corona, so we don't have a lot of time to talk about everything as we wish. So it's enough to have a definition of free verse, some of the distinguishing features or characteristics, and then one good example. Our example for today is a poem that represents free verse. This poem was written by a pioneer of free verse, who is William Carlos Williams. William Carlos Williams is actually a big name in the world of American poetry, and he's famous for having written free verse and he is also famous for having focused on everyday objects and concrete things. Our poem is often quoted in anthologies that talk about modern poetry. And as you will see the poem, I think you will understand why it's one of the important poems. The Red Wheelbarrow by Carlos Williams. Look at this image of chickens and a red wheelbarrow. I think you can now know what we mean by red wheelbarrow, and you can see that the poem is going to be about concrete things. So, what's the poem that we are talking about? It is the red wheelbarrow, and this is our poem. The poem that we have is short, as you can see, and some of its lines are just one word. So, let us read the poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. So, what's up with the poem? Now, if I want to paraphrase the poem, it's going to be very simple. Um, the summary of the poem goes as this: it feels as though many things rely on the use of a red cart with a single wheel. The one I see now is sitting outside, still wet from rain, next to some white chickens. Okay, so what's that? Many critics who analyzed the red wheelbarrow emphasized that the poem ultimately represents the imagist ideals in its focus on a specific image rather than narrative or lyricism. You know, let me explain the meaning of narrative just to put things together. If you still remember My Last Duchess or the ballad Sir Patrick Spens, what do these poems do? They actually tell stories. In My Last Duchess, we have a speaker who speaks to an unidentified listener, and he tells him about his last Duchess and the problems that he had with her and how eventually he kills her at the end. So it tells the story. Also, ballads are important types of narratives. Like Sir Patrick Spens tells the story of a sailor who was sent to sail across the sea during the times of rough storms, and how at the end he was able to perform his task, but eventually he lost his life. So, this is what we mean by narrative poems. Lyricism is a noun taken from lyric, and lyric is what we call a poem which is expressive in a personal manner, and it expresses personal feelings and emotions. And I think we took some examples, including William Shakespeare's Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, in which he spoke about his feelings towards the beauty of his beloved. And for example, you have The Passionate Shepherd to His Love, The Nymph's Reply. All these poems are lyrics. So, in what way is our poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, different from these poems? Well, it does not tell a story, it does not express feelings, it just portrays an image. So, the focus is just showing an image. And this really belongs to a school of thought known as imagism. Imagism, which means that we can communicate our themes in poetry just by focusing on images. Perhaps there are more objects like the red wheelbarrow that are also worthy of such tender regard. So, this poem is different from the other poems that we studied because it does not tell a story, it does not express feelings, but it rather focuses on mundane, ordinary objects that we see in our everyday life. According to the school of imagism, objects that we see in real life are worth our attention and they deserve to be subjects in poetry. The red wheelbarrow is considered as an enduring and universal tool used by people for thousands of years. I'm sure you have seen different wheelbarrows. I myself saw many of them, but actually they were not red, they were green. Most of the wheelbarrows I saw in my life were green wheelbarrows. I don't know about yours. And why is this thing used? Well, it's either used by farmers to load their crops and tools, or most likely it's used in the works of construction and building. They put cement or probably their tools in it. And the red wheelbarrow might seem insignificant to you, but you have to know that the foundation of civilization is built upon it. Actually, it's a very important tool. Now, the poem doesn't only focus on the red wheelbarrow, but also on its surrounding environment. And it could be also used in urban as well as rural communities. So the poem is an attempt to contemplate, and contemplate is like think deeply about something. The poem's contemplation of the red wheelbarrow can be read as a meditation on the link between humanity and the natural world, as well as an assertion of the importance of respecting the latter. So the poem really invites us to think of ordinary things that we encounter on daily basis. And we have to respect everything that surrounds us because everything has a function. Everything is important, and in the times of need, it is really vital. And the red wheelbarrow is like that. Okay. Now, since farmers and laborers are the ones who use the red wheelbarrow, sorry, so it could be a symbol for the working class. I mean, for the people who use it. It can represent the working class. And what kind of working class? The people who do their work manually, using their hands, that is. Examples on this group of people could be farmers, miners, construction workers, etc. It could also be a stereotype for being unskilled and unintelligent. Skilled workers are workers who need skills, not just physical labor. Physical work in general is misclassified as lowly or simple. And this thing ignores the complexity that goes into planting, pollinating, etc. Some people look down at these workers, but if you think about it, This work is really difficult and demanding, and it's not easy to do. So why should people look down at such work? Why do people often undervalue it? The question is, can we survive without these works? The answer is very clear. No. No one can do without farmers, laborers, or miners. So the red wheelbarrow is a symbol for this group of workers who use the red wheelbarrow and other wheelbarrows of different colors. Okay, so this poem can be actually read as an acknowledgement and celebration of the working class. It could be a tribute to the working class, since it acknowledges and celebrates their work and places a great value on it. Now, it's not only the red wheelbarrow which is mentioned in the poem, there is something along with it. Well, what's that? If you still remember the slide that shows the chickens, you know, when you think of red and white, these two colors serve as contrasts. When you put something red next to something white, the two colors become more festive. They become clearer. They become more vibrant, actually. So it's not only the red wheelbarrow, but it's also the presence of the chickens. This could be an allusion to agricultural workers, and it could be a reminder of the significance of farmers to society. In addition to that, if you look at the red wheelbarrow in the picture, and in addition to it, the white chickens, plus the outdoor setting, we could speak of the importance of society working harmoniously with nature. So we have to put the three things together: the red wheelbarrow, the white chickens, plus the surrounding nature. All these things should work together as one team, and no one should work against the other. Well, isn't it true that these things are important when they are put together? Isn't it true that everything that we see in this life should work with and support the other in a very beautiful and harmonious way? I think yes, for life to continue, we have to put things in a harmonious manner. Now, is the red wheelbarrow as presented in the poem, is it being used? Actually, it is neglected. It is put there without any kind of utilization. So, is it possible that the poet is sending us an implied message? Isn't it possible that the poet is saying that our red wheelbarrow isn't actually being used? And this could represent the consequences of failing to appreciate the value of the wheelbarrow and all the things that it represents. I mean, the working class, it represents manual work. So it could be something like that. Okay, then if we think of the poem, yes, okay, we analyze the red wheelbarrow, the surrounding the surrounding setting of the red wheelbarrow, the white chickens. Okay, now what about this kind of thing? Glazed with rain water. If the red wheelbarrow had been used, we wouldn't have had rainwater. The fact that it's glazed with rainwater indicates that it is not being used. It is actually at rest. And it has recently rained, and the owner is not using the red wheelbarrow momentarily. But there is also the possibility that the red wheelbarrow has been neglected for some time. When you put something aside and you don't use it, it means that you neglect it and you're not using it. Okay. So, taken on a broad symbolic level, the inactive wheelbarrow might represent the ways in which society takes laborers for granted and will recognize their importance for the day to day functioning of society. They are not working, much like when trash collectors go on strike and garbage begins to pile up because no one is taking it away. Okay, so we fail to notice the significance of anybody or anything unless we are in need for it. So this is again another level of meaning, that nobody recognizes the significance of the red wheelbarrow unless we don't have one. So it could also suggest the relationship between human beings and nature, because somebody here let the red wheelbarrow work like this. It is just gathering water and rust, and this in itself is ignoring these tools and these objects. All right. So notice that this kind of small thing like the red wheelbarrow is full of meanings actually. So the red wheelbarrow seems to symbolize several things in the poem. On the one hand, the wheelbarrow can be taken as a representation of farm life in general, especially when placed in an environment with chickens. Okay. Now, previously, we have tried to show the use of the red wheelbarrow in different works, but right now we will focus on farming. And why should we focus on farming? Because here we have chickens. We have chickens. So it could represent something related to agriculture. So it could be a symbol for farm workers, if we want to be specific. So what's the meaning of so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow? So much depends. Notice that so much is a subject. Depends is a verb. Okay? And upon the red wheelbarrow, it says that a lot of things rely on the red wheelbarrow. So this is an implication that agriculture and farm laborers are really important people. And we should not ignore agriculture and farm laborers. Because when you say so much depends, it means that there are a lot of things that are decided by agriculture and farm laborers. So it could be that the red wheelbarrow represents agriculture. And isn't it true that so much depends upon agriculture? Like, can we eat without agriculture? Of course not. There are a lot of things, not only eating. There are industries which all depend on agriculture. So really, so much means so many things depend on the red wheelbarrow. All right. Now, probably what strikes the attention of any reader who reads the red wheelbarrow is the limited number of words that we have in the poem. The entire poem is nothing but one sentence. So much is subject. Depends is a verb. Upon a red wheelbarrow is a prepositional phrase. Glazed with rainwater, etc. So it's just one sentence. The fact that we say that so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow means that there are a lot of things in this life that would have never happened if we had had no wheelbarrow. So the red wheelbarrow is indeed a necessary tool for work. Or because the red wheelbarrow, rain, and chickens are critical to the farmer's survival. Farmers survive on chickens and also certain agricultural tools. This is how they survive and this is how they do their work. Notice that Carlos Williams wanted uh, to send his message by using specific words. Usually, wheelbarrow and rainwater are treated as compound words, but he breaks them into twos. Wheel one and barrow two, rain one and water two. So he broke the two words, which are compound words, into single words. And probably he has something to say. Definitely, if there is a sender of a message like William Carlos Williams, there is also the receiver of the message, who is the reader. After the reader sees how William Carlos Williams deals with the red wheelbarrow, he is invited to think about the wheel as separate from the barrow and rain separate from water. Yes? So the poem is about how human imagination interprets what the senses relate about reality to human mind. So our imagination is actually affected by words. If you want me to think in a certain way, you use certain words, and each word carries a certain meaning. So here it's all dependent on the imagination of the readers. The readers should try and find meaning in objects like the red wheelbarrow and the rain and the chickens. So human minds interpret what they experience through their senses and find meaning in them. So the other commentators, for example, that we mentioned, have done a great job in trying to interpret the meaning of the poem. So here we finished the analysis of the poem, and I hope that you understood what we were talking about. And I invite you really to relate our poem to the characteristics of free verse. Please have a look at our poem and read the characteristics of free verse again, and please try to analyze why do we consider the red wheelbarrow as a good example of a free verse. I want you to think about images, the length of the line, the concept of stanza, the concept of rhyme, etc. Okay, here we come to the end of our lecture for today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with me. See you next time, and inshallah, we will be dealing with drama.